This thing recording for us. Just some quick notes before we get started. You guys had your first real assignment, writing assignment over the weekend that you guys needed to do. Good morning, Victoria. Bulk of you guys got those turned in. I've got about a third of them graded. I'm going to get the rest of them graded today. For all of those short essays, I am giving feedback. You might want to take a look at it because that would help you on your next writing assignment that you guys have. Just a reminder that writing assignments are 35% of your overall grade. So that short essay was kind of important. If for whatever reason your grade on that short essay is not what you expected it to be, or if you did not get it turned in, you might want to take some time to talk to me about that to see if we can work out a plan to help you. Okay, that goes for you guys online too. If there's a grade that you didn't get or a grade that you don't like, you need to reach out to me, preferably via email, so that we can work out some plan to help your grade before it gets too bad. Once again, there is feedback on all of those short essays. You might want to check them out. A common theme that I saw when I was grading those is bad grammar. I saw a lot of really simple grammar mistakes that could have been avoided had people proofread. So I'm going to recommend that on your next writing assignment, you guys definitely proofread. If you're not comfortable writing, you might want to make an appointment with the language hub. I saw some people that definitely I could tell were a bit they were struggling a little bit with their writing. And I made a note, if that was you, you might want to make an appointment. Morning, Corey. On another note, you guys do have a new assignment this week, along with your group projects that you're continuously working on. This week's assignment is a discussion post. If you look over there, discussion posts are 15% of your overall grade, just to give you an idea of where things are as far as grades. And right here is that discussion post topic. So for this discussion post, you're just going to choose one of the mediums that we're going to discuss. You can even choose drawing that we've already talked about, and an artwork that uses that medium. You can use an artwork that we've already talked about, that's fine. For example, list why you chose the piece and medium, how the artist makes use of that medium. Did they do anything different or interesting with it? How does using the medium help to convey the meaning and better the composition of the artwork? After writing, then you need to respond to someone else's. And by respond, I mean more than just saying, I agree, or yeah, you're right. Like actually give them feedback. And that one is this Friday's assignment. So it's just a short discussion post, just a couple sentences, okay? And you can choose any medium we talked about. You can even choose an artwork that we've already talked about. Any questions about that? And once again, if for whatever reason you don't like a grade that you get, and that goes from now on, if there's a grade that you didn't like or an assignment that you accidentally missed, you need to reach out to me so we can work on fixing that. Oh, it's gonna be one of those days where it's not going to share right. My people online, you guys should be seeing a PowerPoint right now. Do you see it?
Yes.
Thank you. Okay, So today we are going to go into our next medium. Last week we covered drawing. On Thursday, drawing is the most basic medium to start with. Now we're going to move into our slightly more complex version, which is painting. Just like with drawing, there's a bunch of different tools that you can use with painting. So we're going to be going through different kinds of painting today, starting with our most basic one and then getting to our most complex. In the art world, when people think of art, specifically in the Western Hemisphere, most often they associate painting with that word art. Is that true? Not necessarily. There's tons of different kinds of art that we're going to learn about this year. It's just that painting is the one that usually gets spoken about first. And that's because partially it's been around for a really long time. People have been painting since the BCE era, since the Stone Age, and they're still painting today. It's been a nonstop, ever progressing medium that people choose to use. Of course, today's painting is quite a bit different from early cave paintings, just because the materials that we use today are quite a bit more advanced than that. And our first example of a painting is this abstract painting by Gerhard Richter, which is an oil on canvas painting. We're going to be starting off going over watercolor and then oil paints. The oil paints are a paint that's oil based, which is why it's called an oil paint. And it is one of the popular painting styles to use today. So before we start getting into the different kinds of paint, we have to go over the ingredients that make up the paint. There are 3 ingredients that apply to all paints. The first ingredient is the pigment. Pigment is the powdered hue or color. So the colors are ground up into a fine chalky powder, and that makes up the pigment. Binder is what holds all of the pigments together. And the vehicle is what helps to transport that pigment and binder to the canvas. So once again, pigments help provide the color. They're usually in the form of a fine powder. Lita Albuquerque's wind painting does a wonderful job of showing you just how fine the powdered pigments usually are. Here is that wind painting. So you can see that she has painted the background of the canvas and then just blown the powdered unrefined pigments onto the top, creating that pattern with the red. So once again, pigments are what provide color to the paint. Pigments should resist fading over time. So some forms of painting stand up better to fading over long periods of time than others. We're going to come across some that did not hold up so well. And once again, thanks to newer technologies, painting has come quite a long way, and the pigments stand up a lot better to different exposure to sunlight and human exposure. So something that you might not be aware of is that if paint or drawings or really any art form is exposed too much to sunlight, they'll fade. And if paint is exposed to human touch too much, it will also end up fading. There's oils in our hands that break down those paints. So thanks to newer technologies, we don't have to worry about that as much as we used to. A great example of an painting medium that was quite popular during the Renaissance period is tempera. Tempera did not hold up well over time, partially because it's made off of egg yolks, and egg yolks tend to go bad. Correct? They don't last forever. So pigments, once again, are our first ingredient that make up paints. Binders are what hold those pigment particles together. So an example of a binder for oil paint is linseed oil. That's where oil paints get their name. It's from that linseed oil that holds the pigments together. Another example of a binder is egg yolk. So for tempera painting, the pigments are held together with egg yolk. And literally the only thing that separates these two kinds of paint are the binders. So oil paint, it's the same pigment for each one. It's just oil paints use oil and tempera uses egg yolks. Now, way back when, if you were an artist and you were trying to make paints, you would have to buy the ingredients yourself and grind up the pigments yourself. So, for example, if you wanted the color blue, a really bright, rich blue, you would buy a stone called lapis lazuli, which is pretty pricey, and you would put it in a mortar and pestle and grind it up until you got a powder. Then you would, for that one usually was oil, so then you would add your linseed oil and get it into a pasty, buttery consistency. And then for oil paints, your vehicle is tempera, so you'd apply some tempera to that and put it on a brush and take it to your canvas. So it's important to keep in mind that early forms of painting, the artists were grinding their own pigments. Nowadays, we have it easy. We can just go to the store and buy it ready-made in tubes, but back then they couldn't. So like I was saying, pigments are the powder, the color. Binder holds those pigments together, and vehicle is what helps transport those pigments onto the canvas. So vehicles usually are a liquid consistency and are used for thinning out paint. So like I was saying, for oil paints, once you mix in the pigments and the linseed oil, you get a buttery consistency. You can apply that straight to a canvas, but most often people will thin that down with turpentine, and that turpentine then becomes the vehicle. Another example is with watercolors. You guys are aware of those little watercolor Crayola artist things. Have you guys seen those before? With watercolor paints, they're little chips of paint in them. So in order to use those, you have to add water to it, right? That water in turn acts as the vehicle. That water is thinning down those chips of paint, which are actually gum arabic and pigment combined. And the last big vocabulary word for this one is a support. A support is the structure underneath the painting, meaning what you're painting on. Is it wood, canvas, paper? That's your support. Oftentimes with painting, your support needs to be sealed ahead of time, so you need to prime it. Otherwise, your paints are just going to soak up into it and they aren't going to be as bright as you're wanting them to be. Just like if you were painting a wall, you would want to prime your wall before you start painting it to prepare it. Also, you will need to size your support. For example, this mostly applies to canvas. Canvas is a fabric. You're going to want to stretch it out as taut as possible in order to get your paints to work correctly. Because if you're leaving it loose, when you eventually go to mat it under a frame, it's going to change your painting when it's stretched out. So you're going to want to go ahead and size it and stretch it out to what it would be if it was hanging on a wall, so that your painting, it doesn't change when you hang it. And once again, you're going to want to prime that surface. Are there any questions about pigments, vehicles, or binders? No? Okay. Because we're about to get into different kinds of paint now. Starting, of course, with our most basic one, watercolor. So watercolor is those powdered pigments and gum arabic. Gum arabic acts as the binder, so those little solid chips of paint in the Crayola tins are powdered pigments mixed with gum arabic that's been dried out. And then water will be used as the vehicle to thin out the paint so that you can actually use it. And of course, the more water you add to watercolors, the lighter your watercolor pigment is going to be. Most oftentimes, the support used for watercolors is rag paper. That's just a thick paper with a rough texture to it. And you do not have to prime that paper for watercolors. It's the only one that you don't have to prime for. That's one of the reasons why watercolors are the most basic one. They're also easy, basic one to start off with if you're going to start painting, just because it's cheap, easy, doesn't take too much effort to prepare for it. As we go throughout these different kinds of paint, they'll slowly get more and more complex. With watercolors, we use something called a staining technique. Staining just means that we're applying washes of color to a surface. And if you've ever painted with watercolors, you'll know that it's pretty thinned out colors. Oftentimes, artists will achieve the highlights in watercolor paints just by leaving that surface unpainted and letting the white paper show through underneath. You can get watercolors to an opaque consistency though, just by adding less water to it. And opaque just means non-translucent, so the colors are more pigmented. So examples for watercolor are John Singer Sargent's painting. Keep in mind that oftentimes artists will use watercolors to capture outdoor moments. So watercolors are one of the earliest, most portable forms of painting. You just need a piece of paper and your watercolor set and some water. So oftentimes they would be used for outdoor impressions, which is exactly what we see in John Singer Sargent's painting here. So this is done on that rag paper. It did not need to be primed or stretched. And he did use a little bit of pen and ink and graphite, but the colors are done with watercolor. And the super white spots, like right here, are just the actual paper peering through. So another example of watercolor is that gouache, which I mentioned last week a little bit with our ink and brush drawings. Gouache is very similar to watercolors. It's just a lot more opaque and not translucent. If you remember, I said that's the one that has the consistency of liquid whiteout. That's gouache. And if you don't remember our examples of gouache being used by Nancy Spiro last week, you can look at an example on page 4 in your, or on chapter 4 in your book from Jacob Lawrence. But I think we all probably remember what that looks like. Like it says, it's most common in book illustrations of the Middle Ages. If you ever look at those, they're pretty interesting to look at. Very flat, two-dimensional illustrations with interesting objects. And then traditional Persian art. So I kind of hinted at this last week that using an ink and brush technique with drawing originated from Chinese calligraphy and then spread. Because they are using watered down ink and a brush, it does also, beyond falling under the category of drawing, fall under the category of painting, mostly because they're using a brush to apply it. So the modality of applying black ink with a brush also falls under watercolor. Once again, that is descendant from Chinese calligraphy, and it can be seen used in contemporary landscape painting, as well as ancient Chinese landscape paintings as well. Yeah. You can see here. So this was done with ink and a brush. And I know the previous slide said that it's black ink. You can get colored forms of ink, which you can see used here. So the darker areas would be straight ink, and then the lighter areas, the artist added water and watered down that black ink to apply it. Basically the same way you would use a watercolor. Once again, the more water you add to the watercolor, the lighter the color is going to be. Okay, were there questions about watercolor before we move on? It's the pretty easy one. Okay, now we're going to move on to fresco. Frescoes are a lot more interesting, at least in my opinion. There's two kinds of frescoes. There's buon fresco and fresco secco. Buon fresco is referred to as the true fresco. It is also known as the wet fresco, whereas fresco secco is a dry fresco. So for a buon fresco, your powdered pigments are suspended in water and applied to damp plaster. When you do that, a chemical reaction takes place while it's drying, and those pigments adhere to that plaster. So this is that one that I mentioned last week, that if you mess up, you're going to have to jackhammer it off the wall. Because of that chemical reaction that takes place, those pigments are adhered to that wet plaster, and you can't just take them off because they are the plaster. So if you mess up, you have to remove that whole plaster section. So that is why a lot of more modern frescoes will utilize that cartoon. Does anyone remember what a cartoon is? Use our vocabulary with us, Rika. Not a small reference, a actual size reference. So they'll do it in the same size as what the actual fresco is going to be, to refer to try and create as few mistakes as possible. So because plaster does dry fairly quickly, you only do a small portion of your buon fresco every day. So you'll pick out your areas that you're going to do based on joints in the image that you're choosing. Joints are major shapes. So you would stop it like someone's body or a line or something like that. So once again, there's chemical reaction that takes place in which the pigments are bound to those calcium crystals that are in the plaster. This is really, really durable as far as painting because, yeah, it's stuck to the plaster. It's a huge mixed in with it. So it does last a very, very long time. I mentioned at the beginning, some paints have a lot more durability than others. This is one of them that has a lot of durability. This is, of course, best suited for drier climate zones because you do have to wait for that drying process to happen. You don't want to do it in somewhere that's really, really humid. It's going to take a really long time for that to dry. A great example of an artist that used buon frescoes is Diego Rivera. Has anyone heard of him before? Someone should have, because someone did a paper about his wife last week. They'll figure it out eventually though. So here is just a detail from Detroit Industry. It's a rather large fresco. So what I mean about joints is if you see there's kind of a line that goes across and around, they would do their sections. You can kind of even see the joint down on the bottom, day by day, section by section, and they try and pick areas that already had lines in the composition so that you won't have added lines like here. So that it's smooth, it didn't look like it was done in multiple days, even though it was. So once again, Buonfresco is called the true fresco. And once you apply that paint, you can't make any changes. Well, you can, but you're gonna have to start over and that would suck. But it does have a lot of durability with it. So you'll notice probably as we go through these different mediums for the next coming days, they each have their strengths and weaknesses. So for example, with Buonfresco, you're not going to want to do it in some place that's humid, and you're not going to want to do it if there's a chance you might mess up while you're creating it. If you're in a humid place and you're worried about messing up partway through, then maybe you'd prefer to do a fresco secco. But if you're doing a really, really large mural, you're probably going to want to do a Buonfresco because a fresco secco is going to take you forever. So a fresco secco is a dry fresco. Your plaster on your wall for this one has already dried, and you're applying paint to the top of that already dried plaster. So if you mess up on this one, you can fix it. It's not had that chemical reaction take place. It's just paint sitting on top of plaster. The paint that is used for a fresco secco is typically a tempera paint. That is an egg yolk paint that we're going to talk about next. And because you have to, okay, so tempera paint, we're about to find out, it dries very quickly. You also would use it with a very fine brush. So imagine painting a really large wall mural with a small brush. It's going to take you forever. So most often fresco secco is just used for retouching Buonfrescos. So let's say a piece of the plaster is chipped off of that Buonfresco, you would then use a fresco secco to retouch it. But there are artists that have done really large wall murals using a fresco secco, and more power to them, I guess. Fresco seccos were really popular during the Renaissance, which is when we're going to talk about people that have done them. The Raphael School of Athens that we talked about last week, it is a fresco secco. Leonardo da Vinci also used a fresco secco. That's because it's pretty humid there in Italy, and you would not want to use a Buonfresco because it would take forever for that plaster to dry. So they would go and plaster the walls and then paint over top. Another example of a fresco secco is Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel ceiling. Frescoes did have a bit of a revival in the 1920s and 30s in North America and Central America. That has to do partially with, well, in the 30s, the Great Depression. In the 20s, people were buying a lot of fancy buildings and wanted wall decorations for their buildings, which is what happened with Detroit Industry. But in the 1930s, the Great Depression happens, and the United States needs some way to get artists jobs. So they would pay artists to go to federal buildings and post offices and paint frescoes. So there's a post office in Odessa that has a really famous fresco from the 30s because of that. You wouldn't think Odessa famous, but yeah. I actually think that one has been moved though. I think they took it off the wall and it's located in the Ellen Art Museum because there was a child that threw a soda at it like in the early 2000s and almost ruined it. So yeah, I think they moved it. So a great example of the resurgence of frescoes. This is the whole Detroit industry instead of just the small detail we were looking at right here. It's the whole thing. So it's rather large. This is a blonde fresco once again, but if there's any touch-ups that need to be made, they would do it with fresco secco. And Diego Rivera's most famous blonde fresco is Man at the Crossroads. It was originally done for Rockefeller Center. Like I mentioned, in the early 1900s, people were wanting wall decorations, especially for famous buildings like Rockefeller Center. So John D. Rockefeller hired Diego Rivera to make a large wall fresco. However, Rockefeller did not know that Rivera was going to put the communist leader Lenin on the fresco, and this was like when communism was first starting. And if you don't know anything about democracy versus communism, yeah, that ended up sparking a whole Cold War. But here is that Man at the Crossroads fresco. Once again, this is a blonde fresco. And you see the man, he is representing those crossroads. On one half, you see Rome and the Republic and the United States being represented. And then on the other half, there's Lenin right there, and you see communism being represented. One of those looks a lot more violent and not well off in comparison to the other one. So Rockefeller saw this, and he saw that this gigantic wall mural that he just paid a lot of money for was in fact supporting communism, and he did not want to be arrested as a communist, so he had it jackhammered off the wall. And Diego Rivera ended up making a reproduction that can be found in Mexico City. The actual real one no longer exists. So moving on from fresco to encaustic. Encaustic is one that nobody ever does anymore because it's really difficult to work with. That's because you use beeswax. The other reason being is you have to use beeswax to do this, and beeswax isn't super common to come across large amounts of. So for encaustic, the beeswax actually acts as both the binder and the vehicle. The pigments or the powdered chalky colors are suspended in the hot beeswax, and then you would melt that beeswax and keep it at a melted temperature in order to transport it onto the support, which was usually wood. It's pretty difficult to use because you have to have a certain amount of temperature control to keep that beeswax melted while you're using it. Also, once you've painted a painting, you don't want it to sit out in a hot summer day because what's going to happen with that beeswax? It's going to melt, yeah. So people don't usually use encaustic painting anymore. The most prominent people group to use it were the ancient Greeks. It was also popular during the ancient Egyptian and Roman times. So ancient people used it. But you can get really beautiful, detailed, realistic looking paintings using encaustic. And they have a lovely little shine to them thanks to the beeswax. Which we can see here in the portrait of a boy. This was most likely done after the death of this boy as a way to remember or memorialize him. Okay, moving on from encaustic to tempera, another one that we don't usually use anymore, but it was extremely popular during the Italian Renaissance. And that is mixing pigments with egg yolk, and the egg yolk binds those pigments together, and then you would add water to transport that egg yolk and pigment onto a canvas. So water is the vehicle. Tempera is very matte, especially in comparison to the encaustic beeswax painting that we just looked at. You can get quite a few precise details with tempera painting, but it dries very quickly, so you have to work very fast with it. If you make a mistake, you have to be very quick in catching it and correcting it. And tempera paintings constantly need to be retouched. Also, the paint changes colors when it dries, so you never really know what you're gonna get. If you ever have the opportunity to go to an art museum that has a lot of Italian Renaissance works in it, you might want to look and see if the medium is tempera, because oftentimes they'll have a little bit of a greenish hue to them, once again, because they're using egg yolk. And those go bad. But it was a great medium for the Italian Renaissance artists to use because it worked well in their humid climate. So once again, colors change while it's drying. It's not super flexible because it dries so fast. You can't make changes to it really. And you do have to do several layers of painting in order to get a lot of depth to your colors. They're a bit more translucent on application. So our example of a tempera painting is going to be one of Botticelli's works from the, once again, Italian Renaissance. This required several thin layers of paint in order to achieve good colors. And here is that painting there. So there's a lot of detail. He did get some depth in the background, but that's just a characteristic of Renaissance painting. And there's quite a bit going on in the whole story. And there's shadows and lights and everything, which you can achieve those with tempera painting. My personal favorite kind of painting is oil painting. Oil paints became very popular in the Northern Renaissance. So in the Italian Renaissance, they used tempera painting. In the Northern European Renaissance, they used oil paints. And oil paints, ever since their creation by Jan van Eyck, have been the preferred method of painting in the Western world ever since. So once again, linseed oil acts as your binder that binds those pigments together. and turpentine acts as the vehicle. That's what's used to thin out the paint from that buttery consistency. And once again, the front runner of basically the guy who invents oil paints is Jan van Eyck. We're going to look at a painting by his brother and him, which is Madonna and Child with Chancellor Roland. So this would have been a primed canvas with oil paints. You always have to prime your canvas, otherwise the oils just end up seeping into whatever your support is, and that will in turn distort those images. We're going to look at a primed wood panel. That's the support for this one. You can also use canvas with oil paint. And with oil paints, usually you will apply a top glaze when your painting is done and dried. That glaze is a translucent, shiny film that you put over top to protect the oils. With oil paints, you can get a lot of refined and detailed textures, like it says, and you can see them here. So the textures are quite a bit different in comparison to the tempera painting. With this one, you can see that this is metallic. You can tell the different textures in the fabrics that are going on. And you can still get that detailed background. So once again, advantages of oil paints. If you mess up with oil paint, you have a lot more time before it's going to dry to fix it. So that's the biggest advantage there. You can also apply the paint very thickly and make it very opaque to start off with instead of having to layer on different layers of paint over and over again. Or you can give it transparency by adding more turpentine. And it is pretty flexible as far as supports. You can use canvas and you can use wood. Tempera paintings primarily use canvas. I forgot to mention that before, but it's usually canvas. Oh, and the colors don't change when it's drying. That's a big plus in comparison to the tempera. So last week we learned the vocabulary word impasto. Impasto is typically used with oil paints. That is the very thick application of paint with like a cake batter, buttery consistency. You achieve that by using less turpentine. So the less turpentine you use, the thicker your paint application is going to be. You can also apply oil paints in thin washes by adding more turpentine. You can make it the same consistency as tempera and watercolors, you just have to add more turpentine to it. You can also paint directly onto a canvas in one sitting. That is because oil paints nowadays are in tubes. So you just need your tubes. You can put it on a little palette and then apply it directly onto your canvas in one go. Oil paints are the first paints used like beyond watercolors out in plein air, outside, painting outside in one sitting, and that was first done by the Impressionist artists in 1870s. And the Impressionists were known as the Impressionists because they would capture their first impression of what they saw. To do that, they had to have their paints with them. A great example of an artist that used oil paints in a very thick impasto manner is Thomas Woodall's Rembrandt's Indulgence, which we see here. You can literally see how thick that paint is, right? It has a texture to it. Okay, you can also use oil paints in a more spontaneous approach. You guys don't have to write this. I'm going to start going a little bit faster, such as Joan Mitchell. This is her diptych. And moving on from oil paints to our more modern inventions of paint, we're going to start off with acrylic. Acrylic paints were invented in the mid-20th century. And for this one, your binder that holds the powdered pigments together is an acrylic polymer or a synthetic polymer, basically a plastic. And your vehicle is water, which is a lot better than turpentine. In case you don't know what turpentine is, it's a very toxic thing to be around. You're going to want to use it in a very well ventilated area wearing a mask. So acrylic paints are a lot easier in comparison to that, in case you don't have a well ventilated area. Acrylic paints are also a little bit cheaper than oil paints are. Plus you don't have to invest in turpentine and things like that. And they work relatively the same. So they have a slightly faster drying time than oil paints, but the fun thing about acrylic paints is if you mess up, you can just prime that area that you messed up in and go over it again. So if you mess up, you can fix it. They are very permanent and long lasting paints, so there's not like retouching that's required for these. Oil paints tend to flake off, and tempera, like we said, changes colors over time. So those have to be touched up fairly frequently. Acrylic paints have not shown that required touch-up thus far. And you can apply very thin layers of color. You can apply thick layers of color, once again, depending on how much water you're using. If you add more water to acrylic paints, it's going to come out thinner. If you add less water, it's going to be a lot thicker. And you can layer on different layers over and over again, and it's not going to matter too much. This is probably the easiest version of painting beyond watercolor that we've talked about today. And an example of acrylic paints being used is this statue and Truett's Return, which is acrylic on wood. With acrylic paints, you do need to prime. So that is important to keep in mind. So this would have been a primed piece of wood, and then the acrylic paint was put over top. And another contemporary approach to painting is using an airbrush or a spray can. With airbrush, you can get thin application of paint, very smooth looking application of paint by using a controlled mist. Airbrush also applies to, once again, graffiti spray cans. Graffiti artists favor spray cans over using brushes because spray cans are a lot faster and easier to come by. You can require less tools because they're trying not to get caught. such as the works of Kelty Ferris and Jeremy Blake. Both of them use an airbrush technique to paint with, which we can see here. You can see all the different layers of airbrush paint colors that Kelty Ferris used to get kind of a holographic effect. Here's Jeremy Blake's Sodium Fox. This is actually a still from an animated film. So how many of you guys knew there are that many different kinds of painting? Yeah. Not many people realize there's that many different kinds of painting. There's quite a few. Like I said, every form of painting has its own strength and weakness. And oftentimes, once artists have played with all of the different kinds, they will pick their favorite and stick with it for the rest of their career. In fact, you're going to notice that as we go throughout these different mediums for the next coming days, that artists will pick their particular niche and not leave it. That's just because people have their personal preferences of what they like to use and work with versus others. So that being said, tomorrow we are going to continue on. I believe tomorrow is printmaking. It should be anyways after this. Printmaking uses paints to make multiple copies of things, so that's why we did painting first. Just a little recap of all the paints that we've gone over. We started with watercolor. We went over wand and fresco secco. And caustic. Tempera. Oil. Acrylic. Forgot how to spell for a second. And airbrush. So for your discussion posts, you can use anything that we've talked about already and anything that we're going to talk about. And you can focus on what kind of paint they used, what kind of drawing utensils they used, what kind of printmaking it is for what we're doing tomorrow, so on and so forth. So if you want to go ahead and figure out what image you want, once again, you can use one that we've talked about and figure out what medium you need to learn about. That might be a good start. Keep in mind also that you need to continue working on your group projects. Over here, I've written all of your important dates and what those assignments are weighted as in case you're curious. And those are all of your assignments for the rest of the semester. Other than that, I'm going to stick around until 9:20 if you guys have questions or need to talk to me about anything. And you're welcome to stay in here until 9:20 working on your group project if you'd like to as well. Other than that, I will see you guys tomorrow.